Welcome to photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is what allows something so small, like this tiny seed of a redwood tree, to grow into one of the largest living things on our planet. And plants, of course, can do this without eating anything. So we are going to explore that process today. As you already know, producers, autotrophs, make their own food in the form of sugar, and they do this through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. We don't want to forget about chemosynthesis, which occurs in these weirdos that live in deep sea vents in places where there's no sunlight, where scientists used to think life was not possible. And these organisms don't use sunlight to power their reactions. They actually use chemicals that are toxic to us. The other ones, on the other hand, are using photosynthesis. So here is the photosynthesis equation in its simplest form. Plants need carbon dioxide and they need water. They need energy from the sun to power this whole process, right? And they produce sugar and oxygen. Sugar is that food. That is the whole point of photosynthesis. And oxygen is something plants release as a byproduct. So you want to think of the left side of the equation as reactants, and of course the right side of the equation as your products of photosynthesis. Now, the actual chemical formula for photosynthesis is this. There's 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, which is here in A, and that's one reactant. There's 6 molecules of water, which is the B over here. Okay, that's the other reactant that plants have. It's powered by energy from the sun. And the products of this chemical reaction are this weird thing, C6H12O6, but that shouldn't look so strange to you at this point. That is a carbohydrate made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And the specific carbohydrate here is glucose. So this is the glucose sugar that plants make. And the other product is the oxygen. There's 6 molecules of oxygen released during photosynthesis. So this is the balanced chemical equation of photosynthesis. Okay, so we know light is very important for plants, so let's discuss what light is. So light is actually electromagnetic radiation that moves through space in waves. And there's other forms of electromagnetic radiation that don't include visible, light, things like radio waves, for example, which have low energy and they're very safe. And then very high energy forms of electromagnetic radiation like gamma rays, for example, and X-rays, which we want to minimize our exposure to. So the visible light is actually just a small, tiny part of this whole spectrum, but it is the part that's important for photosynthesis. The wavelength of the light actually determines its color. And here you can see the wavelength in nanometers. This is 700 nanometers, 400 nanometers when we get to the violet end of the visible light spectrum. Light is organized in packets of energy known as photons. And then the last term that we need to know about light is pigments. Pigments are molecules that absorb light of a certain wavelength, and there are really important pigments that we need to consider in photosynthesis. And here are some of those pigments. This here is chlorophyll. These are carotenoids, and these are really the main ones we're going to discuss, and they absorb different wavelengths of light. So plant pigments actually help to gather the energy inside of sunlight, and the photons that are in light excite the electrons in the pigments, and they cause those electrons to move to a higher energy level, and they help power this photosynthesis reaction. Chlorophyll is the main plant pigment. It's probably one you've already heard about. Chlorophyll doesn't really absorb light in the green region of the spectrum. It doesn't really like the green light. It actually throws it back out. It reflects the green light, which is why plants look green to us. We see it because green is being reflected. Chlorophyll is very good at absorbing blue and red light. Okay, so these are plant pigments. It turns out chlorophyll comes in different flavors, and one of those flavors, the main one, is chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll A participates directly in the light reactions, which we will cover later today. Chlorophyll B, you want to think of as an accessory pigment, a helper pigment, and it helps indirectly in photosynthesis by transferring its light to chlorophyll A, which is the main chlorophyll pigment. And then we have these things called carotenoids, and these absorb violet and blue-green light, and they are responsible for the yellows that you see in daffodils, or the orange you see in an orange peel or carrot. And here you can see the different types of light that each type of plant pigment absorbs. And you can see there's kind of a lull here in the middle because none of these pigments really absorb green. They reflect that green. And you can see that the chlorophylls are good at absorbing the blues and the reds. And you can see that with the spikes on the two ends. Okay, so here is what chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B look like. They're chemical structures. And where do we find this chlorophyll? Where do we find these pigments? We find it in an organelle known as the chloroplast. You want to think of the chloroplast as the photosynthesis factory. So if I take a leaf and I zoom in on the leaf, I'll find an individual leaf cell, which is here. And in that leaf cell are a lot of different organelles, like the nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum, all that stuff you learned in middle school. And one of those organelles is the chloroplast, and that's where photosynthesis happens. There are certain structures in the chloroplast that are important. The thylakoids are these flat discs here. Okay, and they are important because they contain the chlorophyll, and this is where the light-dependent reactions occur. Now, a whole stack of these thylakoids is called a granum. More than one granum is called a grana. So you want to think of thylakoids as like individual Mentos or lifesavers, and the whole stack of them is called the grana, right? Okay, the stroma is this part. It's actually a gel-like material that's found that kind of fills up the chloroplast, and this is where the light-independent or dark reactions occur. Here are some chloroplasts found inside of a cell. You can see that these plant cells, these are each plant cells, are stuffed full of these chloroplasts, all right? So here's a little treat. This is microscope imaging or microscope video of a plant cell, and you can see something known as cytoplasmic streaming. And what's happening here is you have basically nutrients moving around and the chloroplast moving around in the plant cell. This is going to help transfer nutrients to different organelles inside of the cell. All right, so you can see those adorable little chloroplasts moving around, and you can just relax and enjoy the chloroplast a little bit before we move on to the next bit, which is going to get a little bit more complicated. All right, so this is cytoplasmic streaming, and you get to see the chloroplast visually, and you see that they're green because they contain chlorophyll. Okay, let's say goodbye to the beautiful chloroplast and move to the next thing. Okay. Before we talk about the individual reactions of photosynthesis, we have to discuss energy carriers, electron carriers, okay? So we're going to really be looking at two pairs. One of them we've already looked at, that ADP and that ATP pair. Another one that's important for photosynthesis is the NADP plus NADPH pair. Okay, and before we discuss them individually, we have to look at two different types of chemical reactions involved. And we've touched upon these before, but we are really going to define them here. So redox reaction is one type of reaction. It's an oxidation reduction reaction. And what that means is that one molecule accepts electrons, which means it becomes reduced. We call it reduced when it accepts extra electrons, which have a lot of energy in them. Okay, so you want to think of the reduced version as something with a lot of energy. And it accepts these electrons from another molecule, and that molecule becomes oxidized. That is going to give up its electrons. So this always comes in pairs. That's why it's called a redox reaction, because it has oxidation and reduction. One molecule becomes reduced, one molecule becomes oxidized. It's also called an electron transfer reaction. So an example of this is that NADP plus accepts 2 electrons and hydrogen atoms to form NADPH. NADPH has the electrons, so it's the reduced form. It's the high energy form. The other thing that we've already touched upon in the last lesson is something known as phosphorylation, which is another type of reaction. And in this reaction, a phosphate group is transferred from one molecule to another. And this is another method of energy transfer. The one that we used as an example was how ADP gains an extra phosphate group to form ATP. All right, so here are the two reactions. and these are very important for photosynthesis. We have the redox reaction. We're going from NADP plus, and we are going to NADPH, which is the reduced form, right? That has the extra electrons in it. And then phosphorylation, we're adding an extra phosphate group to ADP to form ATP. And you might remember this image from last time. Okay, so here we have the ADP, adenosine diphosphate, with 2 phosphate groups. We're adding an extra phosphate group to form ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. This is phosphorylation. So these are going to be important in photosynthetic reactions. So we talked about the photosynthesis equation, and it turns out that photosynthesis isn't simply one step. It's actually a series of many steps, many reactions. And the first set of reactions are known as the light-dependent reactions. And the light-dependent reactions depend on, you guessed it, sunlight. So they are reactions they're all in the chloroplast, and they occur here in the thylakoids. And we mentioned this earlier. So the sunlight is going to go into the thylakoid. It's going to be absorbed by the chlorophyll, which is found inside the thylakoids. And that light energy is going to be used to split the water. Okay, and this is the part of photosynthesis that's using that water. So this is why plants need to be watered. And as a result of the light-dependent reactions, you are going to be releasing oxygen as a byproduct. Okay? The other thing that's going on in these light-dependent reactions is ADP is undergoing phosphorylation to become ATP, and NADP plus is getting reduced to become NADPH. All right, so these are now high energy carriers, high energy molecules that can then go to the light independent reactions and power those reactions. So this is the light dependent reactions of photosynthesis. The second set of reactions are the light independent reactions. Sometimes they're called the dark reactions. They are also called the Calvin cycle after the scientist who helped discover them. So the light independent reactions occur in the stroma, which was that gel-like substance. And what happens here is you have carbon dioxide being reduced into carbohydrates or sugars, so this is the part of photosynthesis that requires the carbon dioxide to come in. And since these reactions don't use sunlight, they need some kind of energy. So they get these high energy molecules, NADPH and ATP, and that helps to power this process so that we can reduce CO2 and get sugar out of it. In the process, we're going to be left with NADP plus and ADP, which have to go back to the light-dependent reactions so they can come out charged again as an NADPH and ATP. So you want to think of this as a fully charged laptop, and that's a fully charged phone. That energy is used up in the light-independent reactions to make sugar, and now your half-dead phone and your half-dead laptop go back to the light-dependent reactions, which have light to help out, and they get charged again. Okay, so that's the light-dependent and light-independent reactions in a nutshell. So at this point, I want to bring it back to the photosynthesis equation because it's very easy to get overwhelmed by photosynthesis and the complexity of all the chemical reactions and energy carriers, and you have to sometimes take a step back and just understand the basics of the reaction. At the end of the day, photosynthesis starts with carbon dioxide, and it starts with water, and it produces sugar and oxygen. These just happen all in different steps. So if we go back to our image of the light-dependent and light-independent reactions, here it is. Water's going in, and that's happening during light-dependent reactions. And yes, we have carbon dioxide going in. That's happening during the light-independent reactions. And just like we saw in the simple equation, oxygen's coming out during the light-dependent reactions, and sugars are being made as a product at the end of the light-independent reactions. So I hope that was a helpful introduction to photosynthesis. Next time, we're going to look even more closely at the light-dependent and the light-independent reactions. I hope that was helpful.